And I realized I was also much better about talking about art than actually making art, which is actually a big blessing, because I'm glad I didn't realize that when I was 40 or 50.
After years of struggling to make it as an artist, recognize that maybe you were better at selling art.
Exactly. So I recognize that pretty much like sophomore year in college.
Welcome to the Artelligence Podcast. Live Art's look behind the scenes at how the global art market really works. I'm your host, Marion Maneker. This podcast is brought to you by Live Art, the global art marketplace that puts you in control. Download the Live Art app to get all of the most relevant art market information, as well as access to exclusive private sales. Or visit us at liveart.io. This week's episode is an interview with Esther Kim Varet. She started various small fires in Los Angeles as a project space over a decade ago. Since that time, has grown to become one of the most talked about galleries in LA, representing artists like Kalita Rawls, the Harrisons, and Nikki S. Lee. Kim Varet followed that success by opening an outpost in Seoul, Korea, making her one of the first independent galleries to open there. I hope you'll enjoy this episode. Esther, thank you for taking the time to speak to me. I really appreciate it.
Sure, my pleasure.
I wanted to talk a bit about your history as a gallerist. I mean, you are in this very interesting spot as Los Angeles has become more and more central to the global art world, and as there's a growing art center in Seoul, South Korea, you are one of the few gallerists in both places and not anywhere else. And so I thought we could talk a little bit how you got to this position, why you're in LA, a little bit about being in Korea, but let's start a little bit about how you got into opening a gallery in Los Angeles.
Okay. I also have some news to share, and it's not really official yet, although I have the lease signed and the staff lined up, is that in the spring,
yes,
I will be opening a third location in Dallas, Texas. I only start there because it fits so well into your question. So I was born and raised in Dallas. I am a second generation of immigrant parents whose parents were also immigrants in South Korea from North Korea. So my family is entirely North Korean, and every generation we've immigrated to somewhere else. My entire family ended up in Dallas, including all my cousins and such, for a number of very circuitous and serendipitous reasons. But I was born and raised there in a suburb called Plano, Texas. And I went to a Christian school for 13 years, was raised Southern Baptist, very conservative, but also in an environment where I think I was very interested in the arts, but felt a lot of resistance culturally to exploring that. And it actually, in some interesting ways, and I talked to other Texans about this, it both frustrated me and pushed me to really forge my own path at an early age. And when I was looking for colleges, I had the choice of going to somewhere like Cooper Union or going to somewhere like Yale. I started off as an artist, I would say, but I also loved writing and exploring other topics. And so when I got to Yale, I was both an art and art history major and philosophy major. And I ended up majoring in art history because I just loved how it combined a lot of these different areas of my interest. And I realized I was also much better about talking about art than actually making art. Which is actually a big blessing, because I'm glad I didn't realize that when I was 40 or 50.
After years of struggling to make it as an artist, recognize that maybe you were better at selling art.
Exactly. So I recognize that pretty much like sophomore year in college. And which was actually around the time that I took my first internship in New York City over the summer, and I worked at Pace uptown in their PR department. And I was very interested in how all of these things, the mediatization of art and its production, the actual relationships that go into kind of promoting an artist, making them known, giving them a platform, all of those things became incredibly fascinating to me. And the infrastructure of art in the market became incredibly fascinating to me. So much so that I actually ended up really doing a lot of work early on in my art history career on systems, on market systems and systems aesthetics. And then after Yale, I ended up, kind of long story short, I ended up going to New York, moving to New York, like many people that graduate from college and you're stuck in Connecticut. You're like, where do I go next? You go to New York.
Close by.
Close by. And so I was in an MA program at Columbia, and then I matriculated into the PhD program there.
In art history or
in art history, yeah.
Good old Avery Hall.
Exactly. So you know it. I know it very well. I spent many years up on 116th Street. In that process, I became really interested. I wrote my PhD dissertation, my thesis on Andrea Fraser, but then my dissertation really ended up being focused on certain movements that were happening in the late 60s that enabled museums to partner with corporations and that what kind of trickle-down effect that had on minimalism and post-minimalism at that moment. So
you've always been aware of the corporate and institutional structures that shape art.
Absolutely. It became very clear to me early on what the mechanisms were, and it became really natural for me to enter the art market and art world via the lens of the gallery, because if you start looking at the history of art of post-war American art, none of what we know in art history books would exist without early gallery systems.
Very much so.
And the kind of archives that were left over from those gallery systems and the kind of recordings that were left over from that. So I think, and then institutions also. So yeah, I've always thought, because I came from art history, really about how art history is made and how access to knowledge or practices are, like what it means, what that term gatekeeper means. Pierre Bourdieu was he was like a cornerstone in me thinking about really how these mechanisms worked. And so actually my first gallery was in partnership. I was 24 and I was in grad school. I was doing my PhD. I was teaching, I was TAing at Columbia, and then I had two girlfriends in the city that were 26. We were very young, and we pulled together our money and we opened our first space in West Soho on Van Dam Street, right by, at that time, what was where Gavin Brown was. And opened it. Great experience in the sense that I kind of got a sense of what to do to open a space. Also great experience in learning that closing a space is one of the hardest, is much harder than opening a space.
No one ever has an exit plan. Everyone thinks things are going to be a raging success, and no one really thinks through getting out.
And it was actually right around a little bit before the market crash of 2008 that I pulled out, which at that time seemed like a very hard thing to do and like kind of the end of the world for me. But my parents were very adamant that if the partnerships weren't working, that it's better to get out now than later. And so, and they really wanted me to focus on finishing the PhD because they were afraid that I wouldn't really finish, which, I'm still ABD, by the way. It's like, and I will probably be ABD for a very, very long time. But
you are not the only one.
I am not the only one. So after that experience, met my husband-to-be. We moved out to LA. I was trying to finish my dissertation out there, doing research at the LACMA archives. As a procrastination method, I opened another space in my house, which was on the ground floor of a townhouse in Venice, and just started inviting artists over, and that was the original VSF space. And I actually didn't start the gallery at that particular moment. I didn't start Various Small Fires as a gallery that represented artists. It was, I think, really at that time, more of a project space in my mind. And I really thought for a moment that I could do this without representing artists. And as a gallery grows and becomes more successful, I think you realize that representing an artist is really, and kind of dedicating your belief in that practice is really the right thing to do. And especially if they're risking what they've made or what they've had and giving it to you and asking you to be a steward of it. So opened in LA, and it wasn't until I got to LA that I was like, oh my gosh, like I, for so long, thought it was a disadvantage to be a Korean American in this field, because you work in New York or you're in New York and everybody is excuse my language, white, and Eurocentric in their, especially in New York, everybody's looking at Europe. And I didn't have those connections to Europe. And I always felt like I was at a disadvantage. And it really wasn't until I moved to LA and got very close to Koreatown here and like just the diversity here. And I was like, wait a second. I was like, this makes so much sense for me to retrace the steps of my parents or like my relatives or my lineage and go and open and do something in Seoul. I mean, Seoul though is like, everybody's like, you were so early. And I was like, no, actually, I thought I was very late. Like when I opened 4 years ago, like I knew like K-beauty, K-pop, K-drama, all of that stuff was happening. And Korea has the highest per capita of collectors in Asia. Koreans have incredible collectors. They have incredible institutions and they have no tax on art. So I knew that it was ripe for something. And I really kind of rushed to open it because I felt like the timing was then.
So let's skip back for a second.
Sure.
You said you were originally thinking about doing this as a secondary market gallery?
No, not secondary market, just as a project space, just doing, I'm not a good secondary market dealer. I always say I'm much better, I'm much more talented at burying bodies than digging them up. I think I love being a primary market dealer, and the secondary market thing is definitely a part of my brain. I still, like, if I do it feels like I'm really straining my my mind to do it.
So how did you find artists to represent? Through doing some project work with them?
So it was a combination of things. Like when I moved to LA, I had been doing so much research on artists in the 60s and 70s, Los Angeles artists in the 60s and 70s, because it was part of my dissertation at that moment. And in that process, like for example, Newton Harrison, like the Harrisons, considered the founders of the ecological art movement. I was actually interviewing him for my dissertation while I had various small fires. And in the process of interviewing him, because I was trying to do both at the same time, I was like, wait a second, this work is so important. You are making works about the climate change, like about climate change and the climate disaster in 1969. And like, what is this history? Like, and then you look at the founding of the Earth Day movement, which was in 1971, and where 20 million Americans came out and marched. And that was the start of the Environmental Protection Agency that Reagan felt like he had to sign in. And it's just like there was so much there at that moment. And I really felt like art history had glossed over that. The way that art history had glossed over looking at things like land art, for example. I mean, land art isn't about Smithson and these heroic gestures onto nature. There were artists and activists that were using land art to talk about how to create systems that feed back into nature, that regenerate instead of just take away. And I felt like it was really important early on for us to be a platform and a champion of some of that rewriting that needed to be done. And I feel like, I think we're kind of known more as often about the hot artists that we have or whatever it is, like the hot market artists. But I think the core of our program has really always been about social and environmental consciousness.
That was the other part of the question. So, you're in LA, you're meeting artists through projects and all, you begin to represent them. You open in Korea. It's not like, I don't think many of your artists are Korean. Some may be Korean Americans like yourself, you might have one or two. You're bringing artists that you work with to Korean collectors.
Yeah, so my long-term strategy for Korea has been, because I know Koreans very well. Like I grew up, I spent all of my summers in Korea. I'm fluent in the Korean language. My parents are very Korean. I was raised very, very Korean. I know that once you kind of hit that threshold of making money, like a lot of families and individuals that come into money through certain kind of success, I think Korea is often not multi-generational money, it's new wealth. And people want to play catch up, right? So they buy the Louis Vuitton purses and the Chanel, and it's really about Western luxury or outside luxury that kind of sets them. And then I think for me, I knew that it was important to use my strength coming from the States and having a deep familiarity with the market and the artists here, to bring that as a way to get the collectors there on board with what we're doing.
Well, I was just going to say, that's one of the conundrums of managing an artist's career these days, or selling art, is half of the world is buying art as a luxury item, and half of the world is buying art as a cultural object, engagement in ideas or identities and so forth. And I imagine if you're an art dealer, that's a bit of a delicate line to have to tread. You got to sell the art. Our artists are living off of those sales, but you also have to manage the expectations, and you clearly want collectors who are supportive of your artists. And I was sort of curious when you were saying that, sort of how that fits when you know somewhat of this mentality. Is it a kind of like a turn? The old joke about art collectors are people who ran out of wall space from decorating their house and all. Is it part of the evolution, or is that also part of like the pitch?
They don't have to be exclusionary. I think the most advanced collectors in the world are in America. And I really believe that, because I do think that I look at kind of the very good American collectors that take risks, that have historically bought without a mathematical calculation of their return. They have bought in ways that felt much more philanthropic. And I think that was culturally true. It's changed a lot, even in the past 5 years, I would say. But I think that I have realized that the LA market and the LA gallery for me, which is the biggest space that I have, is the space that I will continue to do the most amount of experimentation in the kind of art we show. Because
you feel confident of your sort of relationship with your collectors there, that they'll come with you, or they'll...
I think the collectors that we have here have the incredible capacity and ability to be a part of trend making. And I don't think that collectors in Korea are necessarily positioned in a place quite yet to do that. And there's still a lot of catch up happening. And so if I can establish a practice here in LA, which I've done over and over and over, and taken it to Korea, it's much easier than me trying to establish a new practice in Korea and trying to take it over here, if that makes sense.
That makes a great deal of sense. I mean, from the outside, we don't think of these multi-space galleries as having that kind of, metropole and hinterland approach, but it's surely true, whether they're started in New York and moved other places or the other way around, that there's a core audience, and if you have a good relationship with that audience, you can do a lot more. And then if you've worked out those ideas both for the artist and for the collectors, it's much easier to present that in a new location where you've kind of distilled it to, here's what works best.
Yeah, and I'm actually, it's not like I opened VSF and we started off in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We're in LA. I'm very proud of the fact that we're in LA, and I'm very proud of the fact that LA is a city of innovators and innovation. And we're in a city where people are setting trends that are international trends. And I really believe in our audience here. And I believe in the sophistication of our audience here. And so because I have so much confidence in what we represent in Los Angeles, I have no problem in taking that and importing it to other parts of the world.
So why do you think that is? I mean, Los Angeles has been a major city for decades. The joke is always that it's a company town because of the entertainment industry, but that's also a very sophisticated, global, and wealthy industry. It feels like it's only been in the last decade that Los Angeles has become this cultural center where all the things you just described can take place, that it's not about, I have to go to New York to see what's happening, that the artists are there, the collectors are there, and now the galleries are there.
I think in the last 10 years, I think what you said in the last 10 years is correct. When I first moved to Los Angeles, it was interesting because I came from New York, and people in Los Angeles felt like I had a lot of street cred because I came from New York. And there were still a lot of collectors that would rather buy from New York galleries than galleries in their own hometown. And it was something that I heard dealers here complaining about all the time. Biggest dealers even complaining about. And it was a paradox, but I think in the last 10 years especially, Los Angeles on the cultural end has become confident in its own abilities. And there has been a lot of investment. You think of the Hammer Biennial, which is about, there's no other biennial that's only about artists of that city. You think about Getty, and what the initiatives, Pacific Standard Time, all those things. There's been a huge cultural investment in the institutions themselves to double down on their own city. And Los Angeles galleries in a very similar way, I think, have done that as well. The kind of core Los Angeles galleries, and a lot of our artists, if you look, are Los Angeles based. And they might not be incredibly well known outside of Los Angeles, but they're very influential for the community. And I realized that it really is my responsibility to highlight those practices, being a Los Angeles gallery. And I will get to your other portion about Korean artists, because I do think it is important to say, this next summer, Koenig and I, so I've been talking to Johan, who also opened a space, and Johan has pitched to me a number of times, let's collaborate on something. I'm like, okay, this is what I think we should collaborate on. We decided that this is actually the best move. I was like, let's do a show on Korean contemporary artists in our 2 spaces in Korea, and really double down on the community in Korea. We do now show more than ever. For me, the Korean American experience is something that obviously resonates with me in such a way that I think the Korean American experience is a globalized experience, and it is, and all those feelings of alienation and confusion and hybridity and hapticness, all of those things are incredibly important for all of us in this, on a bigger scale, for so many other individuals, not just Korean Americans. It's a kind of state that we're all living in, to a certain degree. And that's also one that I could easily get behind. I can't really that easily get behind a certain kind of very Korean experience, in the same way. But I am working on bringing Korean practices actually here to LA and introducing them, because in Korea, there isn't really an audience for Korean practices. It's like everybody wants the other thing.
Well, that's always been a problem in Japan, too, I thought, that, it was very hard for Japanese artists to build enough of an audience. And for a long time, Japanese collectors were more interested in European or American art. And now we have a number of Japanese artists who are getting quite global. We also have, this whole kind of secondary market, based in Hong Kong, at least for the auctions, but that is kind of Pan-Asian and has, a roster of artists that everyone is familiar with. They might be, more of a lingua franca, but they overlap, and there's enough familiarity with them that, people sort of recognize them as global artists as well. I think your point about the Korean American immigrant experience is interesting, just because in America, at least, there's often a nominated hybrid minority. I'm sort of thinking of the Godfather movies and the emphasis on a very sort of sense of what it was to be Italian American and all at a time, and the popular culture impression of Jewish Americans in the 70s and 80s and all. And I do think we've moved on to there are groups that in America now that have become much more the kind of the immigrant experience that everyone sort of thinks about or shares
Right.
in terms of novels or TV shows or whatever. And Korean Americans are certainly very prominent. You mentioned you're from Dallas. There is a large community in Texas of Korean Americans. This is to sort of bring it back. So are you talking about Korean American artists that you can show globally and in Korea, or finding Korean artists that you can show?
Yeah, I mean, for example, the current exhibition up in Los Angeles is Kyung-mi Shin, who is actually, a lot of people know her husband, Todd Gray, the artist, and but Kyung-mi is in her late 50s and has been working for a very long time on mining her family photographs from Korea. And she immigrated over when she was 16, so she feels very much much more of a hybrid than I think I am, because I was born in the States. I feel more American than Korean, to be honest. But
an American who spends a lot of time in Korea rather than a Korean who's been in America.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if I have to, and like my husband's Jewish and my kids are both, so I do feel much more of a kind of emotional tug, but to the American experience, which is fundamentally an experience of dealing with clashing cultures all the time.
So that was the best of the American experience, was the fact that we were polyglot, and you'd have, Irish lawyers using Yiddish in New York, kinds
exactly.
of things, and everyone thinking they're an expert on Szechuan food or whatever.
Oh, yes, 100%.
And to the extent that that kind of cultural diversity, which used to be stuck in New York and LA, has, at least in urban centers around the country, has become more prevalent, is one of the positive sides. What we've lived through the last 5 years has been the negative side of it and all. But I mean, the fact that you're thinking of opening in Dallas is a sign that there's demand and people want to be closer to someone who can, give them the experience of seeing artists and learning more about them, rather than doing it on a trip to Los Angeles once or twice a year.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, as complicated as this might sound, it's like, and a lot of people don't realize or know that I'm from Dallas, or a Texan, because everybody thinks of me as an Angelino, I guess, or Korean, or, it's like, or that Korean American girl. Like, it's just like
that chick from New York who showed up and started selling art here.
Yeah, exactly. So I really tried to hide for a while that I was from Texas, because I had when I left when I was 17, I didn't think I would turn back. Like, I really didn't. I was like, that's my past. This is my future. And I kind of made a very clear line between like pre-Dallas and post-Dallas. I always joke around, but I came from such a sheltered world where my school was, the science was all pro-creationism. We had a pro-creationist library.
Can we go back to that? Because you said something fascinating at the beginning here about having a cultural resistance to the arts. And I wasn't sure if you meant that you yourself, or that, your family, your school, and all, or maybe it's a combination of the two.
I think it was, my family was always supportive of the art part. I think it was really in school that I felt like you were either on the drill team, you played football, it was a very soccer, as a girl, it was very specific to.
Yeah, there's no art team in high school.
Yeah, there's no art team, it was just a very kind of marginal thing. And I liked the teachers there, and they helped me a lot, but it was also a very kind of regional experience. And actually, when I was in high school, I entered a lot of art competitions, like state art competitions and different things like that. And I actually ended up winning a lot of art competitions, a lot of scholarships to different schools and stuff like that in Texas because of the art stuff. But it was almost like nobody else really cared, because it wasn't like a thing at the school.
Did you paint or draw, or
I was a painter.
Plastic?
Yeah. Oil painting.
Do you continue to paint as a hobby, or is that tried that, done?
Well, it's funny. I have young kids now, and they really, like my daughter, especially who's 4, loves crafts and loves making art. And so I love getting the materials in my hands again because it has so many, it triggers a lot of memories for me. So the short answer is no. I don't have a studio. I don't paint. I don't really make anything like that anymore. But I'm also such a sucker for great painting. I think, there was an artist that I just met over Zoom a week ago, and I fell in love with his Instagram because he had so many videos of him just painting. And I was like...
The process.
Just painting. And I was just I was so mesmerized. And I was just I remember those smells. I remember the feeling. I remember that sensation of running a brush, in a certain way. And I was and I just Zoomed with him and I was would you like to do a show? I know we haven't met, but.
So how important is Instagram these days to finding new artists? I'm constantly, running across places where, I was reading something that Matthew Wong had written about an artist that he basically only knew his work because he lived out in Edmonton through Instagram. And it certainly seems, obviously with the pandemic, it's curtailed our ability to get around, but it certainly seems like that has become a much more important way of looking for, finding leads and getting to know someone.
100%. I think it's the main tool for so many gallerists, unfortunately, now. It's when someone tells me about an artist, the first thing I do is open Instagram and see if I can look at their page. And also when I advise, young artists, I'm can you delete the pictures of your dog? It's or whatever it is.
Right. You get frustrated with them if they haven't gotten the clue, hey, this is basically a gallery and you need to structure it and edit just the works that are going to show you at your best.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's go back on that because you said something else fascinating earlier that you were very interested in, and this is pre-Instagram, this experience, the mediatization of art and its production. Mm-hmm. Art as media and artists as media figures has really changed. And I'm most struck. You've been clearly thinking about this before it started and you've lived through it, what your experience has been.
I think first we have to start with how we define media in each era, right? I think before Instagram, before internet, you would talk about books, the photography of artworks and its dissemination through books. And Instagram is essentially kind of like that, but accelerated and democratized. But the problem with that is that you had to have a lot of capital and there were only a certain number of publishing companies and So it's the structures have all changed.
It goes back to what you were saying about gatekeepers, right? The whole purpose of the internet was to get rid of the gatekeepers. Now you've got people, if you build up a big enough Instagram following,
right,
you can have a direct way of shaping your relationship to your audience, and not just the ones who might buy your work, but the people who, understand it and relate to it.
I think it's changed so much so that, and this is just, I'm just thinking off the top of my head. I feel as you were talking, I was oh my gosh, are galleries the old Random House or Simon and Schuster or but
they're still here. That's what's interesting.
Here. Yeah.
That we all thought they were going to be completely destroyed. Now there are fewer of them. Mm-hmm. I think that just sort of the terrain shifts and people who can make the right connection can thrive in different parts of it.
Yeah. I think the only thing that young or mid-tier galleries have going for them is their youth. Is there relevancy that, if you're looking from the vantage point of being a 70 or 80 or 90-year-old dealer, you're I need to stay relevant somehow because I know that, and I'm sure these are the conversations that happen at Random House, or Simon and Schuster, or,
years ago, I worked at those places, and I can tell you, I was once having a dinner with some people at Penguin who were talking about finding some young kid with a leather jacket who could, to be an editor. It was just someone who was hip and cool and knew what was happening with the kids.
I have to say, the art market remains surprisingly conservative and surprisingly committed to these big houses.
Is that because the buyers are nervous to do something because the risk, or is it something else having to do with like the financialization of the things and all?
I think it's probably both. Again, it's like I feel like you look at the fashion houses and it's like what's happened with like LVMH and a lot of these kind of bigger fashion conglomerates and the concentration of wealth. And I think that the reason why they keep on growing is because the people want to invest or buy things that kind of have the aura of that stamp. I think it's similar in art.
I think so too, but I think like you're on the cusp of becoming one of those.
Oh,
I mean, the whole reason to talk to you is that you have established a reputation out in LA. You're expanding to other cities, not necessarily trying to go to London or New York or Hong Kong. You're going to these places, and I think that's exactly the way it will work.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're the small guy and just waiting around for your lunch money to be taken. It's like, you gotta find ways to,
You decide not to wait around any longer.
Yeah, you can't wait around. And so, a lot of it has to do with looking at what your advantage, like when that big guy comes and you're like, the Goliath comes and you're like, listen, like, I'm smaller than you, but I know how to speak Korean.
Eventually, all weaknesses become strengths. That is my belief in this world.
It's just kind of a resourcefulness factor of being the little guy more than anything else. And so, but luckily in this era when things are changing so quickly and often the bigger Goliaths can't adapt as quickly, can't change course as quickly because you're not the little guy. This is when the little guys, if you position yourself right, can
thrive. Yeah,
thrive.
No,
Yeah.
and that really has been your advantage these last few years, even including during this pandemic, which I'm sure has been challenging.
Yeah, absolutely.
I could talk to you all afternoon, and I would like to, at another time, talk to you all afternoon. But for the purposes of the podcast, I think I'm going to say thank you so much for taking the time. This really, truly has been fascinating.
Oh, thank you. I look forward to hearing how this podcast turns out. Yeah, thank you. I'm a big fan.
Thank you for joining us at the Artelligence Podcast. For more episodes, listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to download the LiveArt app or visit us at liveart.io. Please join us for the next episode of the Artelligence Podcast. We're looking forward to it.